I'm Matt.
And I'm Nate.
And this is Not Quite Religious, a podcast where a Christian pastor and former evangelical turned atheist have conversations about faith, religion, philosophy, and life while drinking coffee.
Welcome to episode 6, where we're going to talk a little more in depth about Calvinism / Reformed theology, niceness, and narcissism. And I think it's only fair to start this episode letting people know that, number one, we record about 2 episodes a day when we record. So we have the same coffee as we had last episode, but we know what it is now, because in the break, I grabbed it from the cupboard.
It is called Omar Coffee, and it is based in Newington, Connecticut.
Yeah, and it's organic, fair trade, and apparently reserve. So it ticks all those Western Mass Pioneer Valley boxes.
Yep, and it's 100% Arabica, which means that it's good and not Folgers.
If you do drink Folgers, we're not judging you. Sort of like you can be a Methodist or a Baptist and still be a Christian. You can drink Folgers or Omar and still be a good person.
True. Just if you're drinking Folgers, then it's not Arabica beans, it's Robusta. You learned something.
So I often wish that we just recorded our conversations that we have in, like, when you first get here and in our breaks and then after our podcast. But that would be like 3 hours of recording.
That's a completely different method of podcasting, right? We could just hang out with each other
just
all the time.
Live stream.
Keep it, and then edit it later.
Like Big Brother, the TV show, but...
No, I wasn't necessarily thinking that. That's a whole other level. I don't know that we're that interesting. But yeah.
To be fair, I don't know that Big Brother as a show was that interesting either, but...
Survivor is better.
Yeah. I
have
had a friend who tried out for Survivor. Never quite made it, but, I rooted for him.
People spend so much time on that show crying, and I know that it's, like, heavily edited.
Yeah.
But that is not a good advertisement, at least for me, to want to go on that show. Like, where at least 20 minutes out of every episode is somebody like, this is the worst experience of my life. Like, okay. And you're not going to win. There's 16, 18 people. Like, you're not going to win.
Yeah.
So you're just going to go out there and suffer, and maybe all of America will hate you. Maybe you'll come off really bad in the edit. So there's really no advantages to being on Survivor, but I do love watching it.
I guess, if you're Calvinist, the winner's predestined and determined anyway. Which is maybe a good lead-in. For those who've been listening, I think they have a pretty good idea of what Calvinism is. If you haven't been and you don't, we'll talk a little bit about it. I don't want to get in sort of the nitty-gritty of the theology as an introduction. But one thing I do want to touch on first is that, we've talked about me being part of Acts 29, which is a Reformed church planting network.
Yep.
And also talked about how part of the reason I thought about this podcast was the Christianity Today mini podcast of the rise and fall of Mars Hill, which was about this pastor named Mark Driscoll, who started this church called Mars Hill. Although, if you believe the podcast, he actually didn't start it. He kind of grabbed it from somebody else, took over, and then said he started it. It's kind of a fascinating...
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I think it's in the second to last episode. There was a church planter who had Mars Hill, and or Acts 29. He had this church planting network called Acts 29, and Driscoll swooped in and took it over. Completely lied about how he founded it.
That sounds so unlike Mark Driscoll.
We did say we're going to hit on narcissism as well. What happened in the rise and fall of Mars Hill briefly is this guy, Mark Driscoll, with 2 other people, Leif Erikson, and I don't remember the third off the top of my head, start this church. It's kind of like, it invites culture in some ways where it's like rock music, and they allow the sort of grunge movement of painted fingernails on dudes as long as they love Jesus, and, dark lights, and, a different form of church where there's no pulpit and you can wear jeans and you preach flashy sermons and tell jokes. And he grew this thing to like 15,000 people in 10 or 12 locations. And then when I was part of Acts 29, it was actually expanding into other states. And the vision really became that this was going to be a global church. And then it all collapsed, and it collapsed like really quickly. Like within 2 weeks. Like there were internal problems that leadership knew about, according to the podcast. And then all of a sudden they're like, and Driscoll just resigned, and now we have no lead pastor. Oh, our finances are in shambles. Oh, we've been doing some illegal stuff that we didn't know about. We need to sell all our buildings. There are no more church. Or is no more church. And some of those people like picked up and started their own churches in Seattle and grabbed the congregation. And other people in the congregation had very much my story, where they were so disillusioned and disfranchised, they're not Christians anymore. Some probably are from the podcast are along the lines of you, where you're not going to put them in a box, but they love Jesus, and they would say like, he's primary in my life, but I'm not reformed. I don't know what I am anymore. I'm still figuring it out. And there are some who are like, Calvinism destroyed my life. In the last episode, we sort of talked about how I think Calvinism is the most dangerous of the Christian theologies, except for Waco. And the fringe.
But Waco aren't starting 15,000 people.
I mean, I think they probably want to.
Sure.
Right? I think they're, yeah. I mean, the fact that you can get 15,000 people to believe Calvinism in a city like as progressive as Seattle is kind of crazy. So maybe getting 15,000 people in Waco, Texas, and the surrounding area who are already Christians to believe David Koresh was actually the second coming could happen.
Well, if they would have showed up in Seattle like in typical Reformed garb, suits and ties, gray hair, they probably wouldn't have got 15,000 people.
Yeah. Well, and I think also had they not had Mark Driscoll.
But they have someone who is actually in tune with the culture, like actually gets Gen X cool stuff, like actually got what was attractive and good, knew how to market, I mean, we're talking about a guy who was good at more than just speaking.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like super smart, super talented person.
Yeah.
Super at marketing, like had good sense of style, good sense of music, and knew pop culture really, really well. So that elixir is interesting, and I think still sort of works a lot of times when you can mix a popular, a knowledge of pop culture and a hipness with a real conservative worldview or politics or theology. It sort of like hides the conservatism or the fascism.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I also think, his other skill, besides being a very talented orator and obviously incredibly intelligent, was his ability to pick out people to do, I don't want to say his bidding, but like knowing that this person like is an unbelievable organizational machine, and then convincing that person that they want to be in Driscoll's inner circle. That's also a skill. I would say it's a manipulation that narcissists very often have. And I think Driscoll is like, I want to say I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I took like a biblical counseling class in seminary, but he sort of fits the classic narcissistic. If we last episode we talked about boxes. If we wanted to go down and check the boxes of what narcissism is, I mean, it's Driscoll to a T.
Are we hoping to get an email from Driscoll and a plug for our podcast? Is that what this is about?
I met Driscoll. He's a lot shorter than I thought he would be. His presence is so big when I watched his videos, and maybe it is all Napoleonic. I was like a good head over him, and I was like, oh man.
And you're like 5'10", 5'11"?
Yeah. It depends on the doctor's office and if I've been working all day or not. Because working in the kitchen, I get like 30,000 steps, and so I actually shrink a little bit, and in the morning I bounce back.
Nice.
Yeah. So I think Calvinism is the most dangerous form of Christianity. We touched on that. I think Matt also agrees to some extent that Calvinism is not the only form of Christianity. And I guess I'll let him speak about his opinion of Calvinism.
I'm reticent to say out loud the exact verbiage that you used, that Calvinism is the most destructive form of Christianity.
Except for Branch Davidians.
Yes. That said, I am not a Calvinist, and I'm very not a Calvinist, and I have major issues with Calvinism. That said, I have friends who are Calvinists. Hi, Dave.
Hey,
we
Dave.
love you.
Yeah, you're awesome. You're the nicest Calvinist I know.
And it's not even personal necessarily. It's I actually have a theological problem with it. And I have this quote, and I want to tell you why I'm giving it to you before I do. It's not because he makes any substantial arguments in this quote, but the person making the quote is David Bentley Hart. He is a Christian, an Eastern Orthodox Christian, and what I want to illustrate for our audience is that there are people who identify very strongly as Christians, who have some really strong things to say about Calvinism, and that just reiterates my point that this tent we're talking about when we're talking about Christianity is really big, and it's actually part of my search within Christianity is to find a form that's authentically Christian. In other words, not denying the resurrection, but isn't necessarily in the modern Western Calvinistic tradition. So here's the really mean quote about Calvinism. He says, this is David Bentley Hart, "Look, people think I hate Calvin, and this is only because I do. It's not a personal hatred. It's just that it's an obvious and objective fact that he got everything wrong. He inherited a tradition of misreading, and that he made it worse by imposing very, very modern categories on Scripture, such as a 16th century concept of sovereignty. Calvin's arguments literally have nothing recognizably in common with patristic or Pauline language or anything you find in the New Testament. Calvinists like to tell me, whenever you criticize Calvin, you just haven't read it or understood it. I've read all of Calvin. I understand it perfectly well. He was an idiot. A very brilliant idiot. But he was a moral cretin, and so he was capable of basically believing things about God that make God morally inferior to Satan."
So those are pretty strong words. You're not going to hear an objection from me, unsurprisingly.
The only objection that I would have, I don't actually have an objection to that, other than it's harsh, and I don't want to throw my Calvinist friends under the bus, because I have plenty of Calvinist friends that I think are authentically Christian, and I think David Bentley Hart here, who we just read, would say Calvinism is not Christianity, and I don't know that I would go that far.
Yeah.
But
yeah, so I guess part of the jumping off point of why I think Calvinism is so dangerous is that last line, that it makes God like worse than the devil, or worse than Satan. And then if you're a follower of that God, what kind of person does that create in you? Right? So, I guess we don't necessarily need to get into the finer points of predestination versus double predestination. I was definitely a double predestination guy.